Greetings of peace, assalamu alaikum, distinguished guests. As the director of the Encountering Islam Initiative of the Theology Department at the University of St. Thomas, it is my privilege to warmly welcome you to the keynote lecture of our 6th annual Terence Nichols Memorial Symposium. Thank you for joining us this Wednesday evening. This annual symposium is named in the memory and honor of Terry Nichols, an eminent professor in St. Thomas's Theology Department and a pioneer in this whole region for Muslim-Christian relations, who founded the Christian-Muslim Dialogue Center at the University of St. Thomas, of which the Encountering Islam Initiative is in humble ways a continuation. The Encountering Islam Initiative is dedicated to creating awareness of Islam and Muslims and seeks to present different Muslim voices and perspectives on a wide range of issues in order to facilitate Muslim-Christian engagement at the University of St. Thomas and in the broader area. For the symposium, we invite a resident scholar every year to address contemporary challenges and issues that may be important and relevant for both Muslims and Christians, as well as for people of other traditions and perspectives, with the hope of initiating further mutual engagement, conversation, reflection, and action. This year, we have the great honor of hosting Dr. Najiba Syeed, internationally known and respected scholar, expert practitioner, and public speaker in the fields of conflict resolution, interfaith studies, mediation, education, deliberative democracy, social gender, and racial equity. She's currently the inaugural Al-Hibri Endowed Chair and Executive Director of Interfaith at Augsburg. It's great to have her now in Minnesota. She has previously taught at the Claremont School of Theology and the Chicago Theological Seminary. Her research work and publications focus on faith and community-based conflict resolution, restorative and healing justice, hermeneutics, interfaith just peacemaking, and social justice hermeneutics for interfaith learning, bringing a perspective on these very important issues that is rooted both in Muslim and interreligious studies. Dr. Syeed's achievements are too many to name, so I will just mention that. Maybe I'll mention a couple of them. In addition to her teaching at multiple places, her scholarship, she has served as chief of staff to the first Asian American woman elected to the Los Angeles City Council, Nitya Raman. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. For her work with 2 conflict resolution centers she led for reducing violence in schools and in interracial gang warfare, for which she was named South California's Mediation Association's Peacemaker of the Year. She has chaired national conferences on Muslim and interfaith peace building, served as a mediator in many cases, started restorative justice, mediation programs in many institutions. She's also served as the executive director of the Western Justice Foundation Center and the Asian Pacific American Dispute Resolution Center, and I could go on and on. So we'll stop there for that. So as far as her many achievements are concerned, in this lecture, Dr. Syeed will explore the concept of interfaith just peacemaking. We often speak of peace, but sometimes not enough of justice, and how can there be peace without justice? Rather, the two work together. So Dr. Syeed will illuminate how, drawing on both Muslim and Christian perspectives, how do we build conflict interventions that prize restoration over retribution from spiritual sources and practices based on scripture, oral traditions, and the history of religious communities and traditions. Dr. Syeed will also share examples of restorative peace building and justice in violent conflicts that seek a third way to resolve controversies. Finally, religion is often viewed as the source of conflict and violence. Instead, Dr. Syeed will give us an important perspective on the possibility of how traditions can foster connection, nonviolence, and interfaith understanding. Following her presentation, we should have a good amount of time for questions. So please don't be shy about questions. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to
So I greet you all with the greeting of peace. Assalamu alaikum. So I want you all with me, close your eyes for a second. Just close your eyes. So tonight, what I'm going to ask you to do is go on a journey with me, a journey that is irrational, as one of my mentors says. I want you to take a minute, close your eyes, and imagine a world without violence. So as you're imagining this world without violence, I want you to take a minute and turn to your neighbor and share what is one thing that would be different in a world without violence for you. So take a minute, talk to your neighbor, share one thing that would be different in your world without violence. So because I have only really an hour, I hope that this conversation, that you'll continue it. So I'd love to hear like an answer or two. So let's go from the back over there. Is there someone in the back part of the room? What is one thing that would be different in your world? Does anyone want to share from the back? Anyone along the back? You want to share? Go ahead. Did you share as a pair? Yeah. Absolutely. And that's one example. No police brutality. All right. So how about from the front over here? Anyone want to share what would be different? Because I know all the people in these two rows. I'm going to count. Yeah, go ahead. Do you want to share? You're being volunteered by your friend. No racism. Absolutely. All right. Yes. Weapon-free world. All right. No police brutality, weapon-free world, no racism. Yes, one more. Safety for women and peaceful families. Beautiful examples. So, it seems like an irrational dream, but what I wanted to do is take a journey to help us think about, why do we think it's so difficult to get to that place? Why does it seem so impossible? Why, when we close our eyes and think about a world without violence, why does that seem so far away? So I want to start off with 3 stories. I'm a mediator, someone who does restorative justice mediation. So the first story, I went to law school. I graduated a long time ago, more than 2 decades. One of my first cases when I graduated from law school was in a juvenile justice diversion program. So I walk into the room. If you're familiar with the juvenile justice system in the United States, we're a country that does incarcerate children. So this was a program that was an alternative. So I walk into the room. It's my first case. And there's a 9-year-old boy. His feet don't yet touch the ground. And I walk in, I've just graduated from law school, and I'm asked to mediate this case. So imagine seeing a young boy whose feet don't yet touch the ground. He's already a part of our juvenile justice system. And I was really struck because he was sitting there and I was talking to him, and then in comes, in this case, it's called victim offender mediation. In comes the person that this young 9-year-old boy is supposed to have caused a crime against. So I sat them down and we're talking. Now, mind you, if this had gone to our criminal justice system as it was tracked to, the person who he had taken the money from was an ice cream truck driver that came to his neighborhood on a regular basis, whom he knew. She would have never had a voice in the process. So I sat them down, and the ice cream truck driver says, I know this boy. I love this boy. I see him on a regular basis. So we asked, well, why did you take that money that day? And he said, I was hungry. He said, I didn't have money for school lunch. I was hungry. So a retributive approach to justice would say this young boy did a crime and he needs to be held responsible, but it's a punitive approach. A restorative approach says, what might be some of the other harms that are happening? Why is it that we live in a place where a young child doesn't have enough? That's one of the harms. He doesn't have enough money to be able to eat in school. So what's the solution that came out of this story? A young boy whose feet cannot yet touch the ground, is that the ice cream truck driver said, I'd like him to learn how to do business. So why doesn't he volunteer 3 days a week over a period of time, and we'll work together, and that's how he can repair the harm. So what a different outcome for a young child to have the capacity to learn from a harm that was done and to grow. And for the person to whom the harm was done to be articulating a different solution. So that's story number one. Another story that I wanted to share with you is with actually a group, some of you I hope know who Oscar Romero is, with a group that organizes in Southern California that crosses the border into Mexico and works with Haitian and refugees. I don't know if you're familiar, but through our southern border now, we have refugees from every religious tradition and background. In fact, there is now at the southern border of the United States, on the Mexican side, a special service set up for Muslims because there are so many Muslims crossing into the United States through the southern border. So I went there with a group that organizes a Catholic group, actually, and with nurses. And we crossed the border. What's interesting is to cross the border, there we had large vans that had they had supplies for the refugees that we wanted to work with. So when it was difficult to cross the border with these large vans, they sent out this interfaith group. So you can imagine a rabbi, a Muslim woman, a Catholic priest. They were like, oh no, please, you're fine. It's okay. You can cross, come in. So interfaith work can sometimes take negotiating with border crossing for humanitarian aid. So this was under the last presidential administration. I'm just sharing that for the context. So we crossed the border and we were going to multiple encampments. My Spanish is not very strong. And at one of the encampments, this is the second story, there was a man that came up to me and he had a beautiful 9-month-old child on his hip. And I said, so tell me, what a beautiful daughter you have. And he said, no, this is not my daughter. This is my niece. We've walked for 3 days because this is my niece because her parents, to whom I'm related, were killed in the middle of the night. So I took her, worried that something would happen, and we've been walking for days. And then he looked at me and he said in Spanish, he said, can you pray for me? And I said, well, I'm Muslim. And he said, no, he said, pray in the way you pray to your Creator. Pray because we are in such a dire situation. So sometimes interfaith peacemaking is holding witness to someone's incredible tragedy and doing service, but doing it in each of our own way. I prayed a Muslim prayer. I prayed for the health of this family. And so it was a really incredible story to think about restorative justice, that sometimes it's not just retributive systems, but it's also the ways in which we organize how we do migration that harms some people and demonizes them. The last story that I wanted to share with you, I have many, is annually in Los Angeles, there is a mass held for all the unhoused people that die every year. Over 500 people die in the streets of Los Angeles, not through a shooting, not through a form of violence, but through the capacity or incapacity to get housing. So this mass is done every year, and it's beautiful. It's also become an interfaith event where the names of people are read, and those that are unnamed are also acknowledged. And it's done by the diocese in Los Angeles. And it leads me to talk to you about 3 principles around which we have to frame when we think about peace building. First, how we frame violence. So this notion of interpersonal violence, where it's 2 people who have a conflict, 2 people that you and I might not get along. So we have the president of Augsburg here in the audience. Let's say Paul and I we always get along, so it's not a problem. But let's say we didn't get along, and it's an interpersonal conflict. That is when we have a conflict at the level between 2 people. The next is moving it to community level, where it's not just between 2 people, but it's between communities. So some of the examples that I shared, for instance, have elements of those. And then the last is what Johan Galtung, who's just passed away, talked about is structural violence. So structural violence is really thinking about that mass that's held every year for unhoused people. This is a form of violence where people who are unable to secure housing, they passed away, not because someone inflicted interpersonal violence, but it was the systems in place that kept them out of getting safe housing, and through exposure or some other form, they passed away. So one of the things before we engage in conversations around peace building and peacemaking and imagining a world without violence is understanding that the intervention has to match whatever it is, the dynamic of violence. Sometimes when there are structures at play, when I cross the border to work with someone who's a refugee, we are praying in that moment. That's an interpersonal connection, but the violence that was created there is actually structural. Structures of violence around the ways in which migration happens in war. So we're having an interpersonal engagement, but the violence was actually caused by structures. So I think this is really important because sometimes we're pushed when we think about peace building to only focus on the interpersonal without understanding the structural. So what I wanted to ask you today, the question I wanted to ask us today is, can religions exist without violence? Can religions exist without violence? Could we go on a journey where we move from peace to nonviolence and finally to no violence? And for those of you who study processes of social movements in the United States, is it possible that violence like war, there were movements to abolish slavery in the United States. There's a modern movement to abolish mass incarceration. Is it possible that at some point there could be movements to abolish war and violence? Is it necessary? Is it necessary for religions? Are they defined by the existence of violence? So that's really a question I want to ask for us to think about. For us to think about. If you want to imagine a world without violence, that's also my question. Why is that so hard to imagine? So I'm going to kind of propose a couple of different ways to approach this issue. And one of them is, I think violence is the most, I don't think this is grammatically correct for our English majors in the audience, the most non-imaginative intervention. Violence is the most unimaginative. So part of engaging in non-violence is the ability to think about peace as the more creative option. So what this means when we're working with different communities is to think about how we cultivate our capacity for imagination outside the confines of an over-reliance on violence. So I wanted to share with you, for instance, David Smith talks about Elizabeth Conde Fraser's work. And Conde Fraser, in her scholarship, talks about her own upbringing in the Latino Christian community in the United States, saying that when she was growing up in her church life, there was a space for theological thinking with the capacity to hold on to a diversity of views. David Smith says in sermons, the same pastor, now quoting Elizabeth Conde Fraser, says, always ask where a particular view came from so that we learn to identify context with theological and historical differences. When taking questions, the pastor would say he made it clear that it was fine not to have answers to the mystery of God's love for all the world. Smith goes on to say everything that Conde Fraser describes here is a repeating pattern, not a just one-time intervention. And it is clear from her description that such rhythms were deeply formative for her own approach to Christian ministry. This is not the kind of teaching and learning that happens through, what I'm laughing about, that happens through explanatory speeches, as I'm doing, but the kind that is carried in the iterative contours of our behavior. So what if religious education, here I'm speaking in the Christian context, is not about a download of information, but a regular rhythm of creating patterns? And what if those patterns support peace building over violence? Sabah Mahmood, an ethicist, highly emphasizes in her literature the spaces of moral cultivation, and she particularly emphasizes in her research spaces where we learn not just from didactic means, but from means of interaction, engagement, and real-world experience. Mahmoud documents Muslim women teaching other Muslim women in Egypt in religious schools. And these are spaces that ethicists would have seen as too minor, as too ordinary to study from those an ethics of the ordinary. But I would say that that pedagogy of lived experience, of valuing doing and thinking, of theory and practice, is how we cultivate peace builders in our Muslim educational spaces as well. Because I can't tell you the most abstracted, theorized concept and underutilized as a resource for actual behavior is that of peace. How many times do you hear scholars of religion say, my religion is a religion of peace. What is the practice of peace? What I would do with you, what I do with my students that are sometimes younger, is I'll ask them to draw a picture of what peace looks like to them. And do you know it's not easy? Because peace is so abstract. So I think for the first point that I wanted to think about is, what is our religious imagination around nonviolence as a concept, whether it's a belief, a doctrine, a theology, but what does it actually mean in practice? And how do we educate generations that are coming forward to carry that imagination that you had, that you opened up with and you shared with your friend? Or someone you didn't know, maybe you weren't friends, and now you are friends. So the second thing that I wanted to talk about is, we live in a moment where the machinery of war violates nearly every ethical principle of just peacemaking, or in the Muslim tradition of how war is to be prosecuted. Within the Muslim tradition, for instance, innocents, those that are not engaged in warfare, are not to be killed or harmed. We have even concern around the environment, that you are not to burn the crops of the opposing force. You are not to take and harm the environment as part of warfare, in addition to the concern for innocence. Glenn Stassen, who is actually, I understand, a product of Minnesota, was a mentor of mine before he passed away. Glenn Stassen says he articulated the idea that Christ commits Christians to a strong presumption against war. So Stassen's Just Making Principles, Sermon on the Mount, many other forms of his literature. So we live in a moment where especially weapons, drones, they continue to be used in war. And what happens is the technology of war inevitably finds its way into the streets of the United States as the technology of policing. So these are interconnected forms of warfare. They are not separated out. The technologies used in warfare elsewhere will find their ways into the technology here. So how do we imagine a world? Because, and you mentioned it in the opening, how do we imagine a world without violence? We have to think about violence, not just abroad, but violence here in our communities. So you'll say, well, this is imaginative. This is something that has never happened. But I wanted to remind people that we have, as a world, come to the point of nuclear warfare multiple times. But in fact, it was people of faith that stood up to nuclear proliferation. So I'm just going to share with you the joint interfaith statement to the 10th review. Sorry, this is the lawyer in me. The 10th review conference of the parties in the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. It's people of faith that have consistently stood up against nuclear proliferation. And in many ways, our survival now as a world and our future is precipitated on this history. So I share that with you because it's not unimaginative. It's not something that can't happen. So they say, as people of faith, we are here to remind you, delegates of the NPT Review Conference, of our shared humanity. Despite national interests and objectives that seemingly contradict each other at times, we share the fundamental goal of preserving our planet, our countries, communities, and families, without which we cannot pursue our prosperity, well-being, or happiness. We know that nuclear weapons, whether used by design or accident, will destroy the world as we know it and cause tremendous suffering of many people, as testified by the Hibakusha, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and those from affected communities. Nuclear weapons, this is a multi-faith articulation, people of many different traditions saying nuclear weapons are incompatible with our fundamental values of respect for human dignity. Their continued role in so-called national security should not be tolerated. All of us, as leaders, delegates, civil society, and faith communities, share the moral and ethical responsibility of realizing a world without nuclear weapons. It is up to us to enact this mission, and history will surely show that we took the right course. I will end the quote for you there, but I wanted to share this example because there was an accepting of an inevitability of a reliance on nuclear weapons, and it is a moral voice, a courageous voice, a spiritual voice that stood and said together. And these were actions that were taken all over the world and continue. So I want to remind us of examples in human history where people standing together, they close in saying, our diverse faith traditions remind us that we are not prisoners of our current reality. Each of us are creative, resilient, and capable of creating a world we desire. We trust that you will act in accordance with your moral conscience, and continuing on. And what they end with is one which future generations will take inspiration from. I was wondering if I could get some water. Talking about peace makes you thirsty. So another thing I wanted to talk about is the resource of religion, because religion is so often weaponized as the source of violence. But I want to remind you, as we just did this intervention on nuclear warfare, that there's an alternative. And one of the things that I wanted to interject here was around justice. And I'm going to be using, if some of you know Dan Philpott's work, he is really the major thinker in the area of restorative justice and transitional justice. So Dan Philpott says, perhaps most distinctive of all of these traditions' way of thinking about the most fundamental political virtue, and he talks about justice. Most striking is the claim of some theologians that reconciliation does not merely complement, supplement, fortify, or leaven justice, but it is in fact itself justice. They point to the Hebrew words that translate to the English justice in the Jewish scriptures, tzedakah and mishpat, and point out also that they translate into righteousness, the thoroughgoing right relationship prescribed in God's covenants. Christian theologians point out precisely the same dynamic in the New Testament Greek words for justice. I don't speak Greek, so I apologize for my pronunciation. The several words that begin with the stem dik, most prominently dikiasune. Something much like right relationship is also the meaning of the Arabic word adl, the word from the Quran that most commonly describes or is used for justice. If right relationship is at the core of the meaning of reconciliation, and if justice means comprehensive right relationship, as it arguably does in the Abrahamic religious traditions, then it follows that reconciliation is indeed itself a concept of justice. So he goes on to talk about, it is much like what is now called restorative justice, a concept that was developed first in the halls of juvenile justice systems in the 70s and then was then applied by Desmond Tutu in the early 90s. Restorative justice, thank you, like religious reconciliation, might well encompass punishment, reparations, and the restoration of human rights and citizenship. but it also includes restorative practices, apology, repentance, and acknowledgement and overcoming of hatred, as well as perhaps the most innovative and controversial practice that religious traditions have to offer, and that of forgiveness. So what I wanted to talk about here is this notion that what I would think we want to begin to move to is not just reconciliation, but taking it beyond Philpott's model into restoration. Because restoration, and I don't mean this in the Christian sense of the Great Restoration, but restoration of, that was a very narrow theological joke that I think like 5 people got. But restoration in the sense that that forgiveness, I would argue, is not about a unilateral act. It is about an act that is done. We talked about the communal, interpersonal, and structural elements. What I would hope we would begin to think about is, what is the role of restoring human dignity for that which has been violated in whatever conflict, issue, or space we are in? What does it take to get us to a restoration of full human dignity? Because reconciliation is pushed very often early in a process so that we ask one group or one side or one individual to apologize before there is a restoration of human dignity. And in fact, in interfaith work, more and more I talk less about common ground and more about common humanity. Are we engaged in a conversation and a process that restores the dignity of everyone at the table? Because if it does not restore the dignity of everyone at the table, we may be re-traumatizing. And if we push for reconciliation before there is a level of equality and participation in dignity, we may in fact be re-violating human dignity in that process. So one of the things I think is really powerful is to think about moments in which we begin to animate virtues of compassion. And I think about this muscle of compassion as one that needs to be precipitated on asking 4 questions in any intervention that I do. The first is, who is human? Before I begin any intervention is, who is human? Because you will be surprised how often we began a peace process and not everyone is viewed as human at the table. The second is, are we in each other's futures? Are we in each other's futures? The third is reconciliation justice? Taking Philpott's notion that we are supposed to be, that Philpott says, and I know him and I respect his work, that reconciliation equals justice. I ask when I'm doing an intervention, in this situation, is reconciliation justice? Because if it's done too early, it may not be justice. It may in fact be injustice. The fourth, I think, I said 4, right? I have to commit to 4. So let me give you a fourth. The fourth is, what is sacred? What is sacred? Sometimes what is sacred is not just human beings, but it's their connection to a land, it's their connection to a belief, it's their connection to the local church, the space that it has. What is sacred to everyone around the table? And how do we have a conversation around that? So those are the questions that I think are really important. And some of the beautiful teachings that I think help us exercise that muscle of compassion are really based on recognizing the dignity in the Muslim tradition, the karama, the God-given dignity that every human being has. So for instance, the Quran tells us that Prophet Muhammad, we have sent you, O Prophet, only as a source of compassion for the whole world, rahmah. That what is beautiful about Prophet Muhammad's mission is that it was to be a source of compassion for the whole world. And I share that because the more that we look at these kinds of teachings within any of our tradition and understand that those principles that apply to all people mean that we have to deal with an absence of supremacy and preference for our own. That Prophet Muhammad's mission as a source of compassion wasn't just for a set group of people in a set moment. And we began to see and understand and read texts and stories in ways that we understand that it is in fact our capacity to see the dignity of every human being is that is what separates us out as human beings. Another thing that Prophet Muhammad has said in multiple ways was that in multiple traditions, in his oral traditions, is that God will not show mercy to those who do not show mercy to others. And that others is not, again, quantified or qualified or specified. So that second part of these teachings are profoundly important because you could be the most virtuous person. You could be engaged in acts of goodness that are acts of worship. But if you walk out of the room of prayer and you spit on the unhoused person next to you, and then you are oppressive to the next person next to you, God is taking into account how you treat other people. The piety and the piety is juxtaposed in this saying of how we treat other people is in fact how God views us as human beings. And I think that's really important because we have conveniently often thought about piety as a private piety, as interpersonal, or even just between God and myself. But what would it mean if we began to think about piety as expressing compassion and building structures and systems and curing us of violence in such a way that everybody experiences the same starting point and access to life? So I had many other sayings to go into to show you how we begin to imagine a world where violence is not the story of human beings, where violence is not the way that we approach. And there's a beautiful story of Prophet Muhammad as well that I often tell my kids when they were growing up, that he left life, he left a village in the earlier part of his missions where he was left bleeding and he had been run out of the town. And he was given a choice in that moment. Should this village be destroyed? And in fact, the answer was one of nonviolence. And I share that because there's another aspect of nonviolence that we learn from this story. It's not forgiveness alone, but it is also that we don't operate from a place of personal revenge. Because wars have been started, structural systems have been put in place, decisions for countries and communities and churches and mosques have been made not because it was a decision from a place of we need justice for our community. They've been made from a personal need for revenge. So religion intervenes and says, put aside your ego. Make a decision from a place of virtuous righteousness. In the Muslim tradition, a judge cannot make a ruling if they are angry. Because what happens? And Prophet Muhammad also says that the strength or the character of a human being is not in their domination over others, but in their ability to exert self-control. So again, we come back to this behavioral approach to peace building. So I wanted to share some of these stories with you because peace building is not a soft and sweet endeavor. It is an incredible way of thinking of the world, not just equity and equality, but a work of constant inner reflection, because we want to be involved and build systems and communities and our own interpersonal relationships that reflect the capacity to make a decision out of wholeness. So I wanted to share with you a quote from Thomas Merton. I think some of you guys might know who he is. I don't know how popular he is on campus or not. And Thomas Merton says, God has left sin in the world in order that there may be forgiveness. not only for the secret forgiveness by which he himself cleanses our souls, but the manifest forgiveness by which we have mercy on one another. So give expression to the fact that he is living by his mercy in our own hearts. So it's again, not just that personal relationship with God, which is the foundation for people of belief. And in this room, we may have people who have belief systems. We may have people who don't have belief systems. Whatever your moral way in coming to it, you can have a private method or way of defining your morality. But as Merton tells us in all the stories we've been sharing, it's also what we do publicly, what we create as systems that are profoundly important as well. If we're kind only secretly and cruel in public, ultimately that will lead to all of our mutual destruction. My last point for time was talking about healing justice over transactional justice. So Philpott tells us again, one of the resources of religious intervention or spiritual ethics, he says that abrogating punishment, they argue, in transactional justice is always a sacrifice of justice. It ought never to be re-envisioned as justice and should be permitted only when demonstrably necessary for peace and democracy. He says they are skeptical of goals of religious reconciliation like healing, overcoming enmity, and forgiveness are achievable or only morally just. So he goes on to talk about, for instance, that very often in transactional justice, people only view individual autonomy and they disrespect liberalism's plurality of values and undermine central democratic virtues of argument and deliberation. Finally, intellectuals of the liberal human rights paradigm are chary of religious language in the politics of transitional justice, holding to some version of philosopher John Rawls's argument that political arguments, at least in constitutional matters, ought only to be expressed in secular or public language. So what Philpott is telling us is one of the gifts of spiritual and ethical approaches to justice is that we move, I would take his work and say, we move from the transaction of justice, that it is a harm that has been done and must be restored in due form for political gain. And he says we move it into a space of moral reflection and moral obligation. It's no longer just a question of rights, it becomes a question of the wholeness and the moral fiber of a particular society. So I would point out that structural violence needs to be addressed in any intervention. And too often the language of peacemaking and peace building relies only on the interpersonal intervention. There are many, many programs across the world that fund interpersonal intervention, but there are very few that are willing to look at the structural and community aspects and engagement around violence and peace building. So I think, one of the things that Rabia Terry Harris really helps us think through is she says the solution to trauma is not more trauma, it is healing. So transactional justice says, I've experienced a trauma, let me then impose another trauma as what I get for the trauma you imposed on me. So Rabia Terry Harris says the solution to trauma is not more trauma, it is healing. So can we imagine a world where interventions for justice are not the transactional, but they are the transformational, that they look to create systems, not just interpersonal relationships, that are actually healing, where people are not losing their dignity through mass incarceration, where people are not losing their dignity through methods of starvation and violence that are perpetrated against people in so many different ways. Stassen, again, I go back to Stassen. I think his father was governor of Minnesota. Is that correct? Okay. My father was also a founder of a very large national Muslim organization. So he would tell me, he's like, Najib, I think you and I are both trying to just live in our father's shadows. So it was really funny. It wasn't, I was like, well, my father wasn't quite governor of Minnesota, but okay. And as many of you may know, he taught at an evangelical university, Fuller Seminary, and he would have me come speak to his students. And it was really a beautiful friendship because what I think came out of it, he would always tell his students, thicken Jesus. What he meant by that was thicken the example of Jesus as a peace builder instead of saying, work around the scripture and his example. And I would tell him, okay, Glenn, I guess you're telling me that in my work, I need to thicken the example of Prophet Muhammad. He said, well, yeah, I think that's true. So it was a really beautiful, we call it in interfaith education, Jenny Peace talks about it as co-formation, that I had a mentor that pushed me deeper into my own religious tradition, because he would say as I would often say, I'm a peace builder because I'm Muslim, not despite my religion. And he felt the same as a Christian, and we mined our own traditions for that work. So he would, Glenn really reminded us kind of the hermeneutical point, as he called it. The hermeneutical point that Hayes, Spahn, and I argued is that a biblical teaching should not be only taken at the rules level or only at the principles level, but that we also need attention to the more basic conviction or symbolic world level. At the same time, Hayes and I criticize an overreaction against rules and principles in some narrative ethics. Rules and principles have a place in biblical narrative and in contemporary ethics, if understood as dependent on the deeper theological levels and not legalistically. So Stassen is telling us, in many ways, it's this hermeneutic of how we approach our text that enriches and builds and teaches us the stories and the symbolic nature of what's being said, such that it is not something that we consume from a cognitive aspect, but from an embodied, iterative, and deeply, as he says, thinking about everything and contemporary ethics, not just from what we believe in, but what we do. And I think that's an incredibly powerful approach. And I'm re-injecting Rabia's work on the solution to trauma is not more trauma, it is healing. And I think one of the things that really was really beautiful in the work that I've done is begin to see, because peace building is so deeply engaged in real world systems, is beginning to find theology where it may not have been found before, or to think about spiritual ethics in places it may not have been seen. So I wanted to quote for you Fania Davis, who does intersection on the work between restorative justice and police brutality. And Fania's book, if you haven't looked at it, I would encourage you to look at it. She says something that I think is a deeply theological statement, although she doesn't consider herself a theologian. She says, today, I believe there's nothing more subversive than helping to midwife a new evolutionary shift of the human species into an era where we will no longer be entranced with socioeconomic formations and ways of being and thinking that produce disconnection, domination, and devastation. Where we will no longer be entranced with socioeconomic formation and ways of being and thinking that produce disconnection, domination, and devastation. Instead, we can be present upon the earth in ways that bring healing, wholeness, and a sense of the sacred in our connection with one another and all of creation. It's a really beautiful statement for someone who works on interrupting the school to prison pipeline, because what she's doing in her work is recognizing that it's not individuals that are committing acts. It is also not just the interpersonal, it's systems that have created structural violence. And what she's saying is, in fact, that is really the most subversive thing we can do in this moment, is to think about ways in which we become agents of healing, wholeness, and a sense of the sacred in our connection with one another and all creation. The subversion is an argument for choosing life over destruction. Atin Anwar, in her studies of Muslim women peacemakers, articulates this again and again. I have seen in conflicts, whether it's in the streets of Los Angeles or going around the world, it's women who have lost their children to violence that are the first to stand together as peace builders. Whether it's in neighborhoods here, I can tell you, I have not yet seen it, but I can tell you that there must be grandmothers in Minneapolis and St. Paul that are the most important peacemakers, that their house on the corner is the safe house for everyone. So the subversion of our moment is for choosing life over destruction. And I want to end with, I had two other points, but I don't think we have time. I want to end that I think the most significant intervention, in this case, we're talking about Christianity and Islam, is the sacredness of the life of children. So in the Muslim tradition, Prophet Muhammad has told us that our children have rights over us in one of his hadith, his oral tradition. So what happens also, the construction of that covenant with God, children are an amana or a trust to us as adults. So whether it's children here in Minneapolis, whether it's children across the world, we have a sacred obligation as adults to animate justice and peace building for children. Nelson Mandela, in fact, tells us that the way you measure the humanity of a society, I'm summarizing the quote, is really by how they treat their children. Evangelical Christians, World Vision, talked about this and actually put out a statement. They said, and this had to do with treatment of children in humanitarian situations. It was put out a number of years ago. And they said, as Christians, and this is an evangelical Christian group, as Christians, our understanding of children's rights is rooted in our understanding of God, of how he created the world, and in the Bible's calls to love and serve our neighbors. Children's rights are first and foremost a gift from God. They reflect God's desire for a society characterized by peace, a deep, abiding peace, love, mercy, and joy, a divine reality that ensures all children are flourishing. So I wanted to end with that because I think what can happen if we engage only in transactional justice is that we begin to think about what are the contributions of children? How productive are they? What are they doing for society? But in fact, what we know is that children are the hope of a community and the next generation. And when children are targeted in violence, it's symbolic to cut the hope of a community down for the next generations. So I hope that today, when we have been thinking about the gifts of these two spiritual traditions, that you think about whether it's the case study of a young boy that I opened with, that we think about the religious imagination of nonviolence. We begin to think about the machinery of war and whether we can, in this moment, as it often finds its way into policing in our communities, can we justify the technology of war religiously anymore? And then we think about the examples of restoration over reconciliation, over transaction, over retribution. And last but not least, that we think about healing systems and our agency to create systems that are not yet known, not yet seen, that we don't wait for the next life, but that we create together the capacity for every human being to share in common dignity. Thank you for your time today.